If you want to get advanced in your communications, it's not just about knowing body language and behavior styles and linguistics, but also eye movements. See, eye movements tell us what part of the brain you're using, but it's not where the eyes end up looking, it's where the pupil moves immediately once you ask a question. Now, I'm going to talk about the most natural style or wiring of the human being, but some people are absolutely opposite to this, which means that we have to do this mechanism called calibration. It means I have to ask questions that I know the answer for just to check your eyes are going in the right way before I can then say, well, it has meaning. And when you look at it, a lot of criminology and those types of areas use this to kind of get an idea if the crime has been committed or not based on these things of eye movements. Because the eye movements not only tell me what part of the brain you're using, but also indicate whether you're recalling or creating information in your head. So let's look at that. Interestingly, if I asked you where you grew up and think about the first house you ever lived in as a child, you're going to be doing something called visual recall. And visual recall is when the person looks up and to their left immediately. So I'd flick up there and then I'd be looking somewhere else. That triggers the part of the brain that is visual recalling something from the past. And if I asked you then, imagine that house, but instead of having those coloured tiles on the roof, it has this other colour. Because that's not something you're recalling, you would have to create it. So you automatically will go up and to the right. Now remember, this is you looking at the person. So when I'm going up to my left, it will appear to be your right. So that is recall and that is create. So when I'm asking you about a question and you're thinking about it visually, I'm going to be able to determine whether it's actually something in your head from the past or whether it's something you're creating. Now when it comes to auditory, the auditory is the same because auditory is actually going sideways. If I asked you to recall the noise of a particular animal, you'll be looking to the left, which we call is auditory recall. And in that case, I could say, what did they say exactly? And you go over there and you recall what that conversation was about. But if I said, imagine that animal and that dog was making more of a cat sound, what would that sound like? You'll come to what we know as auditory create, which means you'll come over this way. And if you've ever noticed some people where their eyes are flickering, I used to always annoy me. What is that about? Their eyes are going boom, 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 boom. And they're often speakers or trainers, and they've told the story over and over. And what they're doing is it's like a tape, and they're going back to work out what have they just saying, where have they got up to in the story. So it's like rewinding and going forward in the tape. And that's why they're going from left to right, recall to create, recall, where was I, recall, etc. And that's why the movement of the eyes. Now, have you ever noticed when you're feeling down, you're often walking around and you're looking down to your right? That's your feeling sense. That's your kinesthetic connection, the feelings. And therefore we say that old saying, when you're feeling down, stand proud and lift your chin and look upright. What you're effectively doing is changing your physiology to get you out of that locked state of going into the kinesthetic. And in terms of therapy, if a person's been savagely beaten or raped or something like that, they'll typically be all wrapped up looking down to the right. And what that does with a strong emotion, that locks that experience into their neurology very strong in their memory. Because memory only exists when I create an emotion to go with it. That's why you remember the best things and the worst things that ever happened to you, because there's a high level emotion. Just imagine the last time you drove your car, maybe going to work. You don't actually remember much at all about those moments. But if someone cuts you off on the traffic, or you saw a good-looking person and you were listening to your favourite music on the radio, you would then remember those moments. So there's a direct connection between memory and emotion. So when you've had those bad moments, you're feeling down, you're locking your neurology into keeping you in that state. So in that case, if we came across a rape victim, it's actually to get them out of that physiology and stand them up, because the worst thing we can do is let them lock that memory too strong into neurology. Now, what happens when I look down to my left? Well, this is the questions when you ask me something about process, the auditory digital as we call it, where I go down and I think about the process. I'll go instantly down there and then I'll start talking. So again, it's not where my eyes end up looking, it's where that moment of the pupil first moving. Now, how can we use this? Because in criminology world, they can use this to get an idea whether the person they're talking to is recalling the information or creating it. For example, when people do something extreme, they sometimes want to block that out. They block it out of their memory totally. It's overwhelming for the brain to take on. For example, not that I'm suggesting this, but imagine that I went home and I've shot my wife, accidentally of course, but what happened, it was so dramatic to me that I've actually pretended I walked in and I found her laying in the pool of blood. And when you look at it, this is how it actually works, because neuroscience has proven that if you visualize something with strong emotion, you create the same neural network in your brain as a real life experience. And that means that whatever I'm creating in my brain, I'm actually installing in it. And that explains compulsive liars. Because when you think about it, they come to believe their lies. It's the same as speakers or trainers. They'll tell a story and then they'll enhance it. And they'll tell it again and they'll enhance it. And there's a point there that you can't actually remember what was the real story and what were the pieces that you twisted into it. And of course, that means that two people witnessing the same event will walk away with different concepts of what that event based on their natural filtering system of the brain, but then the stories that they build on it years later, they don't really have the same story. That's because you can put the information in your head. And when you're dealing with self-sabotage or fears, doubts and limiting beliefs, that concept of visualization of where you want to be is actually programming the brain. Isn't that interesting? So if we go back to the wife who's just been shot, and you're asking me at an interview what actually happened, and I start explaining, and I'm actually visually recalling, so I'm going up to the left, that I saw her there, and there was the blood, and there was the gun on the floor. Well, because it could have been so dramatic to me, I might have put those scenes in my head. And now when I'm telling you about them, I'm actually recalling them as if they were really there. So the criminologist then says, oh, maybe this person wasn't the murderer. But when they look at it, then they start asking other questions, because when you put information in your head, you haven't got the whole picture. You're only putting the inserted pieces. So they go back to see if your story is flawed at all. They might come along and say, well, what we don't understand, fair enough, you saw your wife, you ran in there, you picked up the gun, that's why it's got your fingerprints on it, and etc., etc. But they then look at flaws in the system. They'll say, but what we don't understand is when did you put it in your left hand? Because we found fingerprints from the left hand. And because the memory may not be there, if they go to create it, that means that they may not have had it in the brain. But if they're recalling it, that suggests that they know about it at some level. So this is where the criminologist can then say this person could or could not be the murderer. But they can't use it in court, and why? Because you have the ability to override it, as I mentioned. You have the ability to put ideas in your head, and that's that whole concept. If you want to be a millionaire, think like a millionaire. And the more you think like a millionaire, the more you act like a millionaire, and therefore you get the results. Because what we say is your thinking impacts your behaviours and actions that give you your results. So if you want to change your results today, it actually goes back to your thinking. But isn't it interesting that your eye movements indicate what part of the brain you're using? And how can we utilise this? Well, just think what a negotiator can get from this, because with the questions they're asking, tapping into what's valuable to you, what is part of your life and what's not, can be the response on your pupil as opposed to the questions that they're actually presenting. And therefore, they got far more insight in what's happening in your head. This eye movements is a fascinating area, but just remember that you've got to make sure that when you're looking at the person, it's opposite to how you're feeling it. So when the person is looking up to the left, the visual recall, you're seeing it as up to the right. So you do have to reverse it.